Ladies and gentlemen, we love our country. We love it very much. There's no other way that you could explain why we would come online and talk to you about the news and the state of the nation every day to often a lot of criticism, unless we really, really deeply loved our country and wanted to see things improve. But you know who loves our country even more than we do? Peter Groenewald of the Freedom Front Plus.
Well, officially he is Dr. Peter Groenewald, but to us he's Oom Peter. So Oom Peter is the new Minister of Correctional Services. And when this was announced, I was a bit surprised. Interesting to see a Freedom Front Plus in a ministerial position. But what I'm even more shocked to find out is how many people actually love the guy. On Twitter, Black South Africans, for the most part, just say, party time is over for prisoners, no more TikTok in prisons, we are going to have order and discipline. Only in South Africa can you have a huge, big Afrikaner nationalist be praised by people who aren't Afrikaners.
Yes, and so for those of you who wonder, will white people ever be accepted in the cabinet ever again because, racism in the past? Well, Peter Groenewald shows you that actually in this instance, race doesn't matter. And what actually matters is whether or not you love your country. And Peter undeniably loves his country. So let's actually look at what he's had to say. What he's fundamentally had to say is that crime in South Africa is out of control. Nobody disputes that. In many instances, people leave South Africa, they immigrate abroad, and one of the primary reasons that they cite for leaving is crime. As Peter says, you see, the problem is that the judicial system has got itself to a position where you have 80% chance, 80% chance of getting away with the crime. And so he has an answer for this, and that's bring back a death penalty. He says, if you're a murderer, we just need to take you out. Like, hang you in the street, move on to the next guy, prisons don't get overcrowded, and would you know, the bad guy gets taken care of. Fact check. True.
And I think quite a lot of South Africans would want the death penalty to come back, especially based on our crime levels, which are, of course, the highest in the land. But there's this interesting juxtaposition, Byron, between Oom Peter, who is an Afrikaner, and someone like John Steenhuisen, who is a sort of a liberal Anglo from KZN. They're both white. They don't have the same party or the same language or same culture, but one is not liked and the other one is dearly liked. And I think it's because a lot of people think Oom Peter is a racist. I'm not saying he is a racist, but a lot of people might thinking to themselves, he's an honest racist, so we can sort of work with him because he's honest about what he feels. Whereas maybe if you're liberal, you're hiding your racism behind this cloak of liberalism, and that's why you can't be trusted. I know I'm sort of bastardizing this argument a little bit, but do you think there's some truth in that? In terms of Peter Groenewald is just authentic, and people think maybe liberals don't seem authentic.
No, I have a different take on it, and that is that if you actually look at Oom Peter loves his country, he loves his people, and so he deeply wants to see his people success and to stay in Africa. He's not really worried about what the European nations do, or America does, or Russia does. He's more concerned about the poor population. And so one of the things he said in terms of crime is that farm murders are absolutely horrendous and we need to discourage them at all costs because we don't want our people to feel that they can't live here. If you take that and you contrast it against, say, a DA perspective, I'm not going to talk about John directly because I think it would be unfair. But I think if you look at the DA party as a whole, the problem is that they're more, should we say, more globalistic in their approach. They're more liberal globalism, American brand of liberalism, almost wokeism to a degree. And I don't think that that meshes entirely very well in the South African psyche. And quite often what ends up happening is that those individuals are, very unfortunately, listed as being white. Because, these days it's not actually, when you refer to white, you don't really mean a person's race, do you? You mean whiteness. And whiteness is basically liberalism on steroids, progressivism on steroids. Unless, it's African progressivism, then it's communism and socialism. It's very confusing, Ramon. But I think the fundamental difference between DA liberalism and Oom Peter's Freedom Front Plus is that of almost a degree of nationalistic integrity. He really likes the nation of South Africa as opposed to just global liberal values.
I think there's an element of that as well. And I think you picked out, someone said what they like about Oom Peter is the fact that he's not moving anywhere. Like he keeps talking about South African issues, South African people. He's here to stay for the long term. He doesn't have a second passport. He was born here. His ancestors have been here for 400 years. And therefore, I think there's an element of trust in that. Whereas if you read Alistair Sparks's work back in the 90s, an English-speaking person can feel at home here. They can feel at home in Australia, in England, in America. They're sort of like more of like global citizens, whereas Afrikaner is not a global citizen. An Afrikaner is from here and tends to stay here for the most part. And that element of authenticity and the element of rootedness of Willem Pieter in South Africa, I think makes him a lot more popular than people from the DA, irrespective of the efficacy of that particular portfolio. So we can have Leon Schreiber in Home Affairs being really, really effective at Home Affairs. I don't think he'll be loved like Willem Pieter is loved, for example.
No, and so you may look at that and go, is he loved? Like, is he? Well, yeah, actually is, because one of the really shocking things that came out is that the actual trade union for the prison services actually welcomed his deployment. I couldn't believe it myself. I read it twice because I was like, this can't be happening. But they actually welcomed it. And they said it's so nice to actually have somebody who loves South Africa and wants to see the actual prison system improve for the betterment of everybody get appointed, because now he'll return our calls. And would you know it? They sent him a letter and he returned the call. And they were like, we like this guy. So that in itself shocked me. But you know what else shocked me? He said he doesn't want blue light brigades. He says, he's a South African. He wants to travel around South Africa. He doesn't want to be constantly under armed guards and whatever else. And a lot of, let's call it black Twitter, for want of a better word, I thought would probably criticize him because, let's face it, he's a white guy. Black Twitter never really meshes very well. But actually, no, they didn't. They made jokes like, Willem Pieter just needs his Hilux, his hunting rifles, and his him against the world. And it's like, yeah, there is a degree of that. So, yes, Willem Pieter is universally enjoyed by South Africans of all nationalities and races. And I never thought I'd see that. Did you?
Not in the slightest. Not in the slightest. But I'm very happy to see it. Right? I'm not a Rainbow Nation kumbaya kind of person. But if someone told me on Twitter as well, like, Afrikaners and Black South Africans actually get along. They actually share quite a lot of similarities in terms of outlooks of the world. Unfortunately, they try to separate themselves after apartheid, so to speak. But fundamentally, if you look at South Africa as a conservative Christian nation, that is best exemplified by the Afrikaners and the Zulus and the Xhosas and the Bedis and the black tribes of Africa. The odd one out are the Anglos, right? The Anglo-speaking, Anglo-white South Africans who, happen to be within the DA, even though I know for a fact the leadership of the DA are patriots. I mean, Helen's only 72 and she's still fighting for South Africa. She could be anywhere in the world. She's got a huge pension by now, but she's staying to fight because she is a patriot. But she'll never be accepted as one, I think. And that's an interesting dynamic.
Yes, but, I think you're hitting onto something there that's even more interesting than just saying white Anglos, because actually it's a DA kind of liberal thing, right? This idea of this global liberal citizen, because we've seen that even in some of the black individuals in the DA, even they leave, right? I mean, there's, Van Dam, for example. I mean, she left and went to work for Facebook somewhere in Europe and still shits on South Africa as a nation. Like, this idea that once you become almost a citizen of liberalism, if you will, then the nation state doesn't actually mean anything to you. And I think you're 100% correct. A lot of the South Africans that speak English, unfortunately I'm one of them, they do feel like, okay, if South Africa doesn't work out for me, that's fine. Australia will be just fine. Australia doesn't work out. There's England, I suppose. There's America. And it's always the same Anglo-based type countries, right? It's always the English-based territories, the former British colonies, if you will, that they always want to navigate towards, even though those countries at the moment are, quote-unquote, shitholes. So it's very interesting that they don't feel the need to go, you know what, South Africa is my land. I'm going to fight for it till that dying breath, such as the Afrikaners will. And, you see that even in Botswana, right? And Namibia. I mean, the Afrikaners are still there in those territories and they still want to make them their own lands, even to a degree, even in Zimbabwe. Some of the Afrikaner nations want to stay in Zimbabwe. But you saw that with the English, right? The English all left and went back to England. You saw the population decrease from 300,000 to 30,000 because there is no tie to the nation for these individuals. And I think that's really what differentiates a person who loves this country and those who don't. It's this idea of, am I a nationalist or a globalist? Peter's not a globalist. He's a nationalist. And that's why they love him.
I think so too. And I'm not saying that the DA doesn't love South Africa. I just think it's in the way that perhaps they communicate or the way they are seen by most South Africans as being part of the sort of globalist elite that's not tied to any nation, because the ideas, sort of work anywhere, really. Whereas the Freedom Plus is a uniquely South African project. And I think people respect that a lot more. Very interesting times. Interesting that the most popular minister is a hardcore Afrikaner, and that is why we absolutely love this place.